The Subcommittee on Oversight will come to order. I note that a quorum is present, and without objection, the chair may declare a recess at any time. Also, without objection, the meeting record will remain open for 5 legislative days, so members may submit any materials they wish to be included therein. Thank you, Ranking Member Torres and members of the subcommittee, and to our witnesses for joining us here for today's important hearing, the first ever congressional hearing with the Office of Congressional Ethics. The Office of Congressional Ethics, or OCE, was established in 2008 during Nancy Pelosi's first speakership. It was created to independently review allegations of misconduct against House members, officers, and staff. OCE is often conflated and confused with the Ethics Committee, but the two are very different entities. First, while they can intake and review allegations of misconduct brought forward by the public, OCE has no disciplinary authority. Its job is simply to make referrals to the Ethics Committee when it deems appropriate. However, there is little to no transparency regarding which cases OCE decides to open. In the past 10 years, only half of the cases OCE opened were then referred to the Ethics Committee. Second, the OCE referrals carry no extra weight, meaning the Ethics Committee doesn't have to consider any of the OCE's referrals. Third, if the Ethics Committee does not decide to investigate a complaint that OCE refers, the committee starts from scratch and does not even use any of OCE's materials. Despite having Congress in its name, OCE only has jurisdiction to investigate the House of Representatives. The Senate does not have a corresponding entity. This calls into question, if the Senate doesn't need a similar entity, what value does OCE add to transparency and accountability that the House Ethics Committee doesn't already provide? If it's not meeting its intended purpose, what reforms must be made to ensure there is effective and nonpartisan accountability? Let me be clear. I support transparency and accountability. I believe all of Congress should be held to the highest ethical standards. But I also have confidence in my colleagues on the Ethics Committee. In the 15 years of its existence, OCE hasn't had any oversight from the committees of jurisdiction. The goal of this hearing is to begin establishing formal oversight of the office, examine if they are achieving their intended purpose, and identify if reforms are necessary. Unfortunately, we must also ask tough questions about some of the OCE's current practices and recent controversies that have caused both Republicans and Democrats to lose trust in the office. While initially designed to field complaints from the public to the Ethics Committee, in practice, political groups have weaponized the office to file complaints as a way of generating negative headlines, regardless of the merits of the complaint, to achieve a desired political outcome. This has turned the office into a political tool rather than an accountability measure. There have been allegations that OCE itself is leaking reports to the press before being made public. In 2015, Politico magazine wrote a story about how OCE leaked a confidential report to the Washington Post and Politico. Politico magazine wrote that OCE leaked the report because the Ethics Committee told them to cease the investigation and refer the matter to the committee instead. That is well within the Ethics Committee's power to do so. The allegation that OCE would then turn around and undermine the investigation by leaking to the press is highly concerning. With a current annual budget of over $1.7 million, the American people deserve to know that the office is being used as intended and not for political purposes. And finally, we must bring transparency and accountability to OCE leadership. The OCE Staff Director and Chief Counsel Omar Ashmawi is tasked as Congress's ethical watchdog. Yet he has faced several allegations of unethical behavior himself, including allegations of harassment, intimidation, and improper use of official resources. Mr. Ashmawi, I'd like to give you the opportunity in today's hearing to address these allegations, especially in light of your refusal to provide the committee with your own written testimony for today's hearing, but opting instead to co-sign with the co-chairs of the board. May I remind you that you were invited here to give your perspective as the head staffer of the office and give us an update on how the office is operating. Further, I'd like to address an incident involving alcohol this past September. Substance abuse is an issue impacting Americans across the country, and I encourage all who struggle with this to seek help. There's no shame in asking for help. However, Mr. Ashmawi is in a position to pass judgment on the behaviors of members, officers, and staff. So I find it concerning that Mr. Ashmawi was arrested for driving under the influence after he had a stop sign, 2 parked cars, and crashed into the front porch of a house. He admitted to drinking and driving and was caught on video trying to pay the resident to not report the incident to law enforcement. Despite repeated issues with unethical behavior, the board has continued to reappoint Mr. Ashmawi to his position. So we have a lot to dive into today. I look forward to bringing accountability and transparency to an office that has historically operated in the dark. I now recognize the ranking member, Ms. Torres, for 5 minutes for the purpose of providing an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This indeed is a troubling time for government ethics throughout all 3 federal government branches. At this very hour, the twice impeached insurrection inciting former leader of the executive branch and current Republican candidate for President Donald Trump is under arrest in federal court. A grand jury of our fellow citizens indicted him on felony charges of threatening our national security in violation of the Espionage Act and committing obstruction of justice and false statement crimes. Our laws that protect national defense information are critical to the safety and security of the United States, and they must be enforced. Violations of those laws put our country and allies at risk. Meanwhile, at the top of the judicial branch, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas is embroiled in a variety of ethics scandals. For decades, Justice Thomas has engaged in a pattern of accepting and in violation of disclosure requirements, concealing gifts and luxury vacations received from a billionaire political activist who reportedly had a financial interest in at least one case before the Supreme Court. And here in the legislative branch, just last month, a grand jury indicted Republican Representative George Santos on federal charges of fraudulent schemes, money laundering, theft of public funds, and false statements. That's not counting the pending charges he has in Brazil. I can't imagine, Mr. Chairman, having one of our members of Congress extradited by another country. The House Ethics Committee is now investigating these allegations and whether Mr. Santos engaged in sexual misconduct against someone seeking employment in his congressional office. Although more than a dozen Republican House members, led courageously by Representative Diaz-Pasito of this committee, have called on Mr. Santos to resign, House Republicans prevented Democrats from forcing a vote on expelling Mr. Santos from the House. I ask that all members of this committee to take the opportunity during this hearing to join Representative Diaz-Pasito and me in publicly calling on a bipartisan basis for Mr. Santos to resign. It is clear that ensuring ethical conduct here in the House has never been more important. Let me be clear, I remain committed to fighting against corruption from my years of work to hold judges accountable for sexual assaults, to my work as a member of the Appropriations Committee ensuring appropriate use of taxpayers' funds. Throughout this work, I have seen the ways in which a single bad actor overshadowed the good work of essential institutions. I am deeply concerned about the allegations facing one of our witnesses here today, but we must not let one individual define the entire institution. I sincerely thank the chairman for convening this hearing and the witnesses for their testimony. I am grateful that we are here to get the transparency the American people deserve and use this as an opportunity to strengthen the office of Congressional Ethics, because no one is above the law. The Office of Congressional Ethics, or OCE, serves a crucial role as an independent, nonpartisan entity charged with reviewing allegations of misconduct against members, officers, and staff of the House, and when appropriate, referring matters to the Ethics Committee. By the way, while I did eventually find your code of conduct, it did not appear in my search when I looked at your website. It is very valuable for an independent, nonpartisan entity such as OCE to participate in enforcing the House's ethical standards. At the same time, it is important that OCE set an example for ethical, unbiased conduct and ensure fairness in its activities. I look forward to learning more about OCE from our witnesses and working with my colleagues on a bipartisan basis to ensure that it functions as well as possible, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Torres. I now recognize the full committee ranking member, Mr. Morelli, for the purposes of providing an opening statement.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member. I appreciate the opportunity to make just a few observations. And before I do that, I want to thank our witnesses for testifying, and in particular I want to note the presence of a former member of this House, Mr. Barnes. So thank you all for your service. In the Federalist Papers, James Madison wrote, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. It must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself." Created in March of 2008, the Office of Congressional Ethics is an independent, nonpartisan office in the House of Representatives responsible for reviewing allegations of misconduct against members, officers, and staff of the House of Representatives. The office establishment, as the chair has noted, was led by then Speaker Nancy Pelosi after several high-profile corruption scandals involving various members of the House. And given the recent indictment of Republican Representative George Santos on federal charges of fraud, money laundering, theft of public funds, and false statement, it is crucial for the House to effectively enforce its ethical standards. To that end, it's extremely valuable to have an independent, nonpartisan office able to investigate misconduct by House members, officers, and staff, as such an office must itself uphold the highest ethical standards, conduct its work consistent with constitutional due process principles in a fair and unbiased manner, and strike an appropriate balance between confidentiality and transparency in carrying out this very important and very sensitive work. So I look forward to today's hearing, thinking about how we can work together to improve health ethics enforcement, and be anxious to hear from the testimony and any questions from members. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Morelli. And the full committee chairman, Mr. Stiles, also wishes to make an opening statement, but he's tied up in another meeting. So without objection, I'll continue on with introducing the witnesses and swearing them in, and then recognize Mr. Stiles when he arrives. Without objection, we'll take that direction. Also, without objection, other members' opening statements will be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted by the committee clerk by 5 p.m. today. Pursuant to paragraph B, Committee Rule 6, the witnesses will please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative, and you may be seated. I'll now introduce our witnesses. Our first witness, Mr. Paul Vinovich, serves as chairman of the board of the Office of Congressional Ethics. Mr. Vinovich retired as chief counsel of the Senate Budget Committee in December of 2018 after more than 20 years of service as a congressional staffer. Previously, Mr. Vinovich served as the staff director and chief counsel at the Committee on House Administration for 6 years. Our next witness, Mr. Omar Ashmawi, is the staff director and chief counsel at the Office of Congressional Ethics. Before joining OCE, Mr. Ashmawi completed 8 years of active duty service in the United States Air Force. Thank you for your service, sir. I, as well as Air Force veteran, where he was assigned to the Judge Advocate General Corps. And finally, former Representative Michael Barnes served as co-chairman of the board of the House of Congressional Ethics and previously represented Maryland's 8th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives. Thank you for your service there. In the House of Representatives, Barnes served as Assistant Majority Whip and as a member of the Budget, District of Columbia, Foreign Affairs, and Judiciary Committees. We appreciate the witnesses being here today, and I look forward to your testimony. As a reminder, we have read your written statement and it will appear in the full hearing record under Committee Rule 9. You are to limit your oral presentation to a brief summary of your written statement unless I extend this time period in consultation with Ranking Member Torres. Please remember to press the button on the microphone in front of you so that members can hear you. When you begin to speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light will turn yellow. When the red light comes on, your 5 minutes has expired, and we ask that you please wrap up your statement at that time. I now recognize Chairman Paul Vinovich for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having me here. It's good to be back here at the committee. As you mentioned, I served here for 6 years, 4 years as a staff director. We can dive into all the issues you raise on transparency and so forth, but since I served here before there was an OCE, I wanted to talk a little bit about that history that led to the creation of the office. I started here in 2001, which was after the ethics wars of the late 80s and the early 90s, the battles between Jim Wright and Newt Gingrich, when Gingrich used the ethics process to depose Wright and subsequently became Speaker himself, and then found himself subjected to the same process when the Democrats decided they wanted to do to him what he had done to Wright, i.e. use the ethics process to depose him. So following that period, there was kind of a non-aggression pact that seemed to take hold in the House, where members, I think, tired of the acrimony and kind of constant fighting on the ethics front, decided to stop filing complaints against each other. And that had a positive effect of reducing the rancor in the House, but it had a negative effect of the belief taking hold that the Ethics Committee was not enforcing the rules, that it had effectively ceased to function as a guardian of enforcement in the House. In those days, the rules still allowed members and staff to accept gifts from lobbyists, subject to limits. There was a $50 per event and $100 annual aggregate limit. So you could take, a hamburger and a beer, but not a steak dinner and a bottle of wine. And so while these limits were in place, it would be fair to say that not all members and staff were rigorous in their efforts to stay below these limits. It was pretty routine for the limits to be ignored or exceeded, and this happened with little fear that the Ethics Committee would do anything. And then something unexpected happened. When the Washington Post started running a series of articles about a lobbyist named Jack Abramoff, who was taking huge sums from his Indian gaming clients, these articles drew the attention of the FBI and the Justice Department, which launched criminal investigations of Mr. Abramoff and his associates. Many of whom wound up pleading guilty. And as part of those guilty pleas, they started providing the names of members and staff that were helping their clients and that were accepting gifts in excess of these limits. So the consequence of that was members who, had they been operating in a house with a functioning ethics committee, might have received a letter of admonition and a fine, wound up with felony convictions and jail sentences. So, in 2006, as was mentioned, the Republicans lost their majority, largely in part due to this and other ethical scandals, and Nancy Pelosi became Speaker of the House, and she had run on a promise to drain the swamp. So, we're going to get into the virtues of the office and how effective it's been. But at root, I will say that I believe it's useful for members to know that they are being watched. You can say that ethics is what you do when no one is watching, but it's just a a fact of human nature that people behave differently if they expect that there will be consequences for their behavior. Now, I understand you all are watched all the time, of course. We're on television right now. You're constantly watched by your colleagues and your political opponents and the press. What we do is different. We're not trying to win an election. We're not trying to sell newspapers or get clicks. Our job is to focus on the facts and the law and determine if they've been complied with. And if we feel they haven't, we make referrals to the Ethics Committee with our findings. So our purpose is basically, I think, and we'll get into the transparency a bit later, I think is to make the process more transparent, to make it harder for the Ethics Committee to ignore cases. I think we've done that, and we can get into more during the question period.
Thank you, Mr. Vinovich. Mr. Ashmawi, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Loudermilk and Ranking Member Torres. I'm really here to present the staff perspective of our office, and I want to emphasize to this committee and our shared institution that we as the staff know the responsibility that the Office of Congressional Ethics has to not only the House as a whole, but to each and individual one of you. The gravity and seriousness of the work that we do is never lost on us, not for a day, not for a moment. When we go to work each day, we understand that we are working for the House as a primary institution of our republic. And it is only by faithfully performing our duties that we meet our responsibilities to it. Now, obviously, I am also the subject of this hearing, so allow me to put a few things in context. One, I apologize for any confusion. It was not our intention to not provide written testimony initially on the Friday due date. It was our collective understanding that the testimony being provided was a statement of the OCE and that any written testimony was voluntary. And there was a decision by my superiors that I would be here to answer questions that you may have. So purely unintentional, and I apologize. With regard to the allegations against me, you mentioned the harassment, sir. That was a matter that was investigated 5 different times. Each investigation found that I was the victim of an unprovoked assault. I didn't harass anybody or act in any other way that was inappropriate. And every claim that suggests that was determined to be false. I understand the perspective that you have, sir. What I would say is the head of the OCE is also a human being. In my case, it turns out I'm an alcoholic. I recently completed 6 months of intensive outpatient therapy. This is sometimes called recovery. It used to be called rehabilitation, rehab. I continue in that program in a lesser intensive fashion. I have a sponsor. And every day, even here on this piece of paper right here, I have the Serenity Prayer. It's a big deal for people who are addicts. Every day I look at it, and every day I have to think about what happened and say that the people who know me best, the people who know my work best, who observe me on a daily basis, sometimes for as long as 10 plus years, they still have confidence in me to do this job, to be a father, and to do what is necessary to help the House of Representatives in whatever way that I can. Real quick, I think it is key to point out a few misconceptions. One is you made reference to a leak in 2015. It was not a leak. It was a release of a report involving improper trip to Baku, Azerbaijan, where the nation of Azerbaijan was laundering funds through American-based nonprofits to influence illegally members of Congress and their staff. The OCE was responsible for uncovering that effort, which ultimately led to an FBI investigation and DOJ prosecution. And so when the report was not released, it was considered to be of vital importance by the board to release it. And so the board chose, by a unanimous vote at the time, to release the report publicly on our website, not to the press. Real quick, and I know we can get into this a little bit deeper, but Ethics Committee, they do use our materials pretty regularly. We have a robust relationship with them where we provide evidence in our cases. So it's a misconception that they do not. Ma'am, we do have a code of conduct. I'm sorry you couldn't find it. I did look at the website the other day, and I did see it, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that. As far as transparency with regard to what we open, that is done because of a belief that the confidentiality of the people who are being accused of whatever misconduct deserves to be respected. And so we don't publicize all of the information that comes in our way. And lastly, I think that, it is conventional wisdom. The Senate would benefit from an independent ethics institution. But with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.